All right, everyone. I guess I'll get started today. So my plan is about the usual. What I'm going to do is, before we get to our material today, which is a very nice application of supply and demand, I'm going to say a little bit about the exam, of course, and surrounding issues, and then we'll dive right in. And it should be kind of a fun, maybe a little shorter day than usual, post-exam, almost like a special topic thing where we look at a way we can apply some of the stuff we've learned. But anyways, so exam, right? Hopefully you've gotten your exam materials back, both on Top Hat and Gradescope. First, before I get into anything else, great job. It's not easy getting 500 plus students through an exam period like this, and the vast majority of you met me halfway. There were, in terms of just taking care of all of your business and all of that, there were a couple things with, people losing internet access in the middle of the exam, Top Hat stuff, all of that. I think we straightened it all out and got through it. So what's going to happen next? I am not going to go over the exam in detail. We have to keep moving. We have a lot of ground to cover still. But what I would like you to do is have a good, detailed look at your materials. Right? So take a look at your exam grading on Gradescope. There could just be flat out mistakes, right? Like I missed something. You wrote the answer maybe in a little bit out of the box. Obviously, it's better if you write it in the provided area, but if you don't, that's fine too, and we just might have missed it in the grading. So check all that stuff, right? Make sure we didn't erroneously grade what you have, and that you got treated correctly in that regard. And that also goes for the Top Hat stuff. It is the case that sometimes my answer key isn't correct, and if you spot a mistake there, that's even better because then everybody in the class will get a better grade, right? So take a good hard look at all of your stuff. You can put in regrade requests. You can even make an argument to me. You can say, well, Baker, I answered the question this way. Here's why I did that. Can you help me out here? But I want you to sort of think your way through the problem and give me a thorough description of this via email, say. Don't just say, I'd like more points. Can you give me some? Right? I need good arguments and things of that nature to do that. So the idea here is that, we had a pretty comprehensive exam. I thought it was, maybe a little difficult at times. And you did a lot of work on this thing, so you should at least feel like we've graded it fairly, right? I'm trying to make sure that it's graded correctly and fairly at this point. So once we've done this, right, typically what happens is there's a slew of corrections and things that come in over the next couple of days. You don't have to do them now. You can do them all the way up until the end of the semester. That's one of the beauties about the electronic record, right, is that it's sitting there for you to think about at any time. I know a lot of you probably have exams going forward, so if you don't get to it, that's fine. But what I want to do is just wait until I have most of the, the problems taken care of, and then I can just figure out a curve. There will be a curve, right? I think I emailed you that the average was right around 70, which isn't, that's not bad. I curve the final grades typically as well. But, I'd like you to kind of feel like you have an accurate assessment of where you might land in the end at this point, right? So I'll put in a curve after that, and then what I'm going to do is take all the attendance stuff. I'm going to take your homework, your exams. I'll make it into one exam score. I'll upload it all into Blackboard. Blackboard, that is, so there we have the three things that we use for the class. Why Blackboard? It has a very nice grade book. It allows you to do sort of rolling calculations. Some of you have asked me where you stand in the class, and then you can sort of look at that directly and figure out where you stand in the class. So maybe after all this, the dust settles here with corrections and curves, you still didn't do all that well. It's not it's not even close to being the end of the world, right? You can still, of course, get an A in the class. One thing I look for, even if you did terribly on this exam, is I just look for steady improvement as the class goes along, right? So if you didn't do that, I've bombed more exams than anyone in this room, right? In my academic career, and maybe I shouldn't say that, if I'm the professor. That includes in economics, right? That includes outside of economics, and also I've bombed exams all across the academic spectrum, right. So it's all still in play for you. But of course, if you have concerns or if you just want to talk about it, please let me know. Some of you have asked to talk to me after class. That's difficult because, I have to kind of keep moving throughout the regular school day because I have, of course, another class after this one and all that stuff. So I would prefer office hours or even email, or if you want, set up another time. That's fine. Okay, if you do need help, we have our tutoring center, as hopefully I've informed you. The tutoring center is up and running, and that's a great resource. Indeed, every year, these are our, if you sort of go to the tutoring center, you'll also see living, breathing examples of our graduate students, right? Which could be you one day. We have a fantastic bachelor's, a fantastic BA/MA program which melds the bachelor's and the master's together. And you can see these folks in action at the tutoring center. They're terrific. Our TA, of course, is one of these people, Ishi, and she's fantastic if you need help. One thing I might say, though, is, now that we've sort of gotten through this whole first exam cycle, I can give you some more general advice in terms of studying and exams and all that stuff. One thing is, whenever you go and ask someone for help, a lot of you might know this already, so I apologize if I'm insulting your intelligence. Try to meet the professor or the TA, as it were, halfway. Right? That is to say, spend some time diagnosing your problem. Right? Don't walk in and say, I didn't understand lectures 2 and 3. Right? Say, Baker, I followed you up until the point where you said the demand curve was marginal benefits, but then when you moved to computing consumer surplus, you lost me. Something didn't click. Now that it's much easier to work with, right? It's harder when you come in and make, me or a TA practice veterinary medicine, right? Where I have to sort of, go through the entire diagnostic and figure out what's wrong with the patient because they're not telling me, right? Maybe that's not a great analogy, but and that also will help you because, if you put in the time trying to figure out what went wrong, you also learn how to learn. Right, so I often analogize this to, I know a lot of you are involved in the fine arts. If you're learning to play something on, piano or guitar or whatever, oftentimes there's easy parts and there are hard parts, right? And, you get to a hard part of a piece, and, well, what do? When you can't get through it and you can't play it, you slow it down, right? And you relax and you try to play it, at half speed for a while. And then gradually you work that part up till it becomes second nature. And you kind of have to do the same thing. And maybe to push the analogy a little bit further, I can't tell you how to play a piece of music, right? No amount of time me explaining to you how to play this or that will help you actually play it unless you do it on your own, right? A little bit of practice on your own. Things are a little bit harder maybe than they seem right off the bat. I might also tell you, and this is maybe speaking to those of you who are just getting started in your college career, don't automatically quit things that are hard. I think a lot of students do this these days because there's certainly in the college curriculum, there's a lot of easy grades out there for the picking. But I would strongly suggest that you don't search out, I got a bad grade in this econ class. I'm going to switch my major to something where I can get good grades easily, right? I would say that will make it less satisfying for you, the whole educational experience, right? So look for some challenges. And of course, in the end, employers appreciate that, right? They appreciate that you've done a hard major. Economics is one of the harder majors. They appreciate that you've spent time with more difficult material and mastered it. So, anyways, all of those things, I guess I'm, get off my high horse here. The one other thing is I think now that we know all the protocols and how the class is set up and all that stuff, hopefully we can follow. I've been kind of gentle in, not getting too snippy about weird emails and, various top hat things and all of that. So maybe going forward we'll just try to hew the course a little bit more tightly. Yes?
Question. So for the online exam, it says that the test details are still hidden. Is that
Oh, it does?
Yeah. I can't see.
I'll have to look at that. I thought I returned it. No? People are shaking their heads. I didn't. I thought I returned it. Okay.
I got it back.
Okay, some people got it back and some didn't. Maybe it's a refresh issue. Why don't you send me an email and just to remind me to mess around with this. And that also reminds me, the section thing, I've sort of decided that I'm either going to fix it or, Top Hat is. If we don't get it fixed, that's fine. That is to say, if you're enrolled in the wrong section, you're enrolled in section 2, but you're supposed to be coming in class now, say, I'm going to figure that out. It's not your problem. So I know a lot of you were sort of worried about that, like homework grades and things. But I'm taking care of that. Yes?
Is the grade an average between the online and in-class component?
I think that's what I'm going to do, is average the two together. Strangely, sometimes I do something differently based on, if there's a big disparity in performance. But in this case, they were almost identical, the means, right? Right. The mean was about a 70, and the distribution was bimodal. So if you don't know what that means, it means there's a big clump of people right around the mean, but then a clump of people around, the 90s. So, yeah. Yes.
So my answers in an online component was not saved for those graphs. Did anyone else have this problem?
Okay, let's if any. This is your to not sort of litigate the exam as a group. If you have any sort of problems with the exam, not question anomalies, how they're graded, all of those things, please email me. Right? Then I mean, part of this is just me having a paper trail, right? I can fix things. I know I fixed them. And if you've had problems with that stuff, then there's chances that other people in the class also have, and I can fix all of that at once. Right? So please take a close look at your exam materials and email me about any anomalies. Right? I want to get them all fixed, and I want to do so in an orderly fashion with the paper trail and all of that stuff. I think there was another question. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Will the answers for the physical exam be given?
Yeah, I guess I could. I think you can download the rubric when you look at GradeScope. Is that true or is it not true?
You can see for the physical test, you can see the answers on grade.
Okay, all right. But maybe I can post an answer key separately, particularly if you've had issues with GradeScope. I thought I ironed out all of those problems, but if I didn't, I can work on that a little bit. Once again, like any sort of problem right now, you can send me an email about the exam, and I will do my best to deal with it. Chances are, if it's your problem, it's someone else's, so don't hesitate to do that. And like I say, I'm trying to fix everything over the next couple days before I decide on a curve and upload everything and all of that stuff, so you have an idea where you stand. All right, so, okay, I think that's we got to keep moving. Oh, some people, I keep thinking these little things here. Another thing people have asked about is whether or not, what happens is cumulative in the class. And there's the usual professorial answer, which is, well, everything builds on everything as we go along. But not really, right? I'm not going to quiz you on, I'm not going to test you on anything we've said in lectures 1 through 7 going forward. What will matter is, everything from lecture 9, I guess it is today, through lecture 18-ish or whatever, whenever we have our next exam. And that's kind of how it goes, 3 distinct blocks. One reason why I do that, incidentally, is because that allows you to sort of start anew if you've fallen behind for whatever reason, or if you didn't get material, it gives you kind of a restart at a couple different times during the semester. That's really true when we move into macroeconomics, which is the last part of the class. Okay, so I guess that's enough about practicalities. Let's dive into the material for today. One nice little application of supply and demand before we head in a somewhat different direction is to international trade, right? Now this is kind of neat because it's a pretty hot button issue, and it has been for, at least a couple of centuries, right? People have wondered about all these things about whether or not trade, should it be free and unrestricted, or should we regulate it somehow, right? What arguments can we make for regulating trade or otherwise governing it, right? And one reason why I like this, as we think about trade policies like tariffs, quotas, things like that, is that it's another neat application of this idea that in economics, we start with a counterfactual, right? I emphasize this, of course, because a lot of policy debates don't start there, right? But you have to. right? If you want to be an organized thinker about something. So the idea is, well, is trade good? Is trade bad? What's your counterfactual, right? What's your starting point? What are you comparing the bad trade world with, right? Or the world in which trade is bad with. And so we will, of course, do this, or I'll show you how we can do this, and we'll use consumer and producer surplus to form our welfare judgments as usual, once again starting with these counterfactuals. So let's think about a typical market here. And to frame things, let's think about the basic questions. Who wins and who loses when we have trade, right? International trade. And we're also going to do the usual thing here and start with our benchmark and think about what if there wasn't trade. And we'll just think about a particular market. So I should say that, we're going to kind of do a microeconomic analysis of trade, and that will look at a particular market and how trade works in this market. But later on in the class, maybe we'll talk a little bit about the macroeconomics of trade, right? Exchange rates, how the macroeconomy interacts with other macroeconomies around the world. But this is a nice way of seeing some of the, fleshing out some of the big debates in trade. So very simply here, I have a trade, a simple market. My market here is the t-shirt market. You can think about that as sort of a stand-in for the mass market textiles, for want of a better word, market, which is actually quite interesting. So I put this here to jog my memory. Years ago, we were trying to hire someone who we interviewed, and they came and gave a nice talk to a nice seminar for us. And the seminar was about trade protection in mass market textiles, right? So these are things like you go to, you buy a pair of pants at Costco or a t-shirt at Costco or, things like that. It turns out that there are a fairly extensive amount of tariffs, and this person was investigating what that did to consumer prices. So it's kind of like take everything we said about tax incidence and meld it with a trade market. What happens to prices because of these tariffs? And so it was interesting. They found that there were pretty substantial increases in price. So even though that shirt you buy at Costco, maybe if you do buy clothes at Costco, that shirt you buy at Costco for $4 could be even cheaper, right? Was kind of the lesson by quite a substantial margin. It was also interesting that high-end textiles really aren't impacted by tariffs nearly as much. So you buy like an Italian suit or something, there's less of a tariff bump in there. Anyways, I digress. So here we go, right? We have this t-shirt market, and what I would like you to sort of do is say, okay, well, suppose there was no international market for trade, right? Starting with our counterfactual. You look at this diagram and you say, okay, well, we have 40 million, at least as the diagram is drawn here, 40 million t-shirts, all selling at a price of $8, and that's the price, the no trade price we might refer to it as. And of course, hopefully you're getting used to just envisioning the surpluses here, right? You're looking at this and saying, all right, well, there's gains to exchange in this market. I can measure that by looking at, the triangle below the demand curve and above price. That's what consumers are getting. I can look at the triangle below price but above supply. That's what producers of t-shirts are getting. And this is all within our country here, or whatever, we'll say the United States market here. Look at those surpluses. So now we want to think about a way, if you just think about the practicalities of modeling out a situation, what we want to do is we want to say, okay, well, how does this picture change when we allow world trade? There's a couple different ways this might work, and we're going to work it in one fashion first, and then we'll back up and do it in another way. We're going to suppose that there's our price of $8 here seems like it's high relative to the rest of the world. We don't want to think about supply and demand in the rest of the world quite yet, right? That makes our problem difficult. Once again, one thing we like to do as economists is just start out with a simple case where all of the moving parts are pretty clear, right? So we can see how everything is working here. So what we're going to do is just imagine that there's a big international market out there. where t-shirts are being bought and sold at some price less than the price, at least in this case, than our no-trade domestic price. So imagine that there's a $5 world t-shirt price out there, and that our market is somewhat small relative to this international market. This means that at this, if we open up free trade, what will happen is we can buy and sell and import t-shirts at this world price of $5, and that's more or less a given for us. So you might be looking at this and you might say, ooh, this looks like a price ceiling, right? And indeed, you might kind of think about it like that, with a couple of modifications, right? With a couple of modifications. And we're going to think through it as kind of the ideal situation, right? Where we ration our producers at this $5 price, but we then allow the consumers, right, to fulfill all of that excess demand, that shortage demand. And that's kind of how this works, right? We once again, I'll remind you, you might even think about this as just kind of rationality, how it plays out in this market. You might say that, well, let's see, if this big international market out there is buying and selling t-shirts at $5, no t-shirts would come into our country unless our price was also $5, right? So let's start there. Let's say that our price in this country is $5. It has to follow with free trade the international price. If somebody tries to sell a t-shirt here for $6, everybody says, why would I buy that? I can get one at free trade in the international market for $5. Of course, we're abstracting away things like the cost of transport and all of that for now, right? Though, as if you've been following the news, there are some interesting applications or interesting things going on, like with the longshoremen strike, for example. So we'll start there. We'll say that it's a little bit like a price ceiling, and that now our market with free trade has to conform to this $5 price, right? So what does this mean here? Well, producers now can only get $5 for a t-shirt, right? If you're a domestic producer of a t-shirt, you can't sell it any more than someone, all t-shirts being the same and all of that stuff. A little assumption there. Nobody's going to buy a t-shirt if you try to sell one at $6. They'll say, I'll just buy one from the international market at $5. Okay, so we wind up with this price sort of being the price in our market now, which is below the natural price that would occur with no trade, right? Okay. So, unlike the case in which we have a price ceiling, right, normally we would say there's a shortage here of 20 to 60, 40 million t-shirts at this price, right? If we put a price ceiling here of $5 for t-shirts, we would get a shortage. Well, here what can happen is at this low price, products can come in from overseas and fulfill this shortage, right? So we wind up with something like this as our picture. When we open up trade, if you want to think about it that way, right, moving from no trade to trade, the price in our country will drop to $5. Domestic producers only want to supply 20 million shirts at this price, right? Domestic producers. Consumers want 60 million shirts at this price, right? Well, what fills the gap between what producers supply and what consumers want? Well, imports, right? So in this market, we import 40 million t-shirts. And so this is kind of a description as to what happens if you sort of imagine flicking a switch and shutting off trade, turning it on. We can say, all right, well, our market goes from 8 million, or a price of 8, 40 million demanded and supplied in the country, to $5 a shirt, 20 million supplied, 60 million demanded, 40 million imported. Right? That's kind of how our market changes as we go from one to the other. Once again, I'm belaboring the point here because I'm trying to be very clear about getting the counterfactual straight, right? The things we're trying to compare. Well, the great thing is, as economists, we look at this and we can think about how societal welfare changes as we move back and forth between those two things, right? That is to say, how the gains from exchange change. And you can kind of see here the whole picture. Right? If we think about what prices, or if we think about that price of $8 in the market before there was trade, you can look at the triangles here and see, well, let's see, before we have international trade, A would be consumer surplus, right? B plus C would be producer surplus. Okay? That's hopefully you're used to seeing that stuff. After trade, however, right, you can see what happens is consumers now get A plus B plus D, right? We're sticking to our guns here and calculating consumer surplus as the entire area below demand, yet above this world price, right? So consumer surplus grows from A to B plus D, right? And of course you can see here that what happens is producer surplus shrinks from B plus C to just C, right? So I have it kind of here. And it's neat because now we can do all this, understanding the logic behind all these diagrams, we can do this basically geometrically. And one of the nice things about that is that we don't have to rely on specific units of measurement or numbers or, this doesn't just apply to a t-shirt market, it applies to just about any market we want to talk about. Okay. So in terms of the effects on certain people or on certain constituents here or certain parties, you can see here that, winners, domestic consumers clearly win from this. Maybe you don't even need the surpluses to see that, right? You can just say, if the price is lower, that's obviously better for consumers. Well, of course, we can measure how much better by observing that surplus gained by consumers due to trade is B plus D, right? And that's kind of here. Consumers were getting A, now they're getting A plus B plus D. Well, one loser in this equation are domestic producers, right? It's not hard to see why. The lower price means that they can't sell as many t-shirts at the high price they were before, and that's borne out on the diagram here by, producer surplus was B plus C, now it's just C, right? And so you can kind of see that in the way I've written this out. But we can also, we haven't said it, but there's also international producers out there. This is sort of not on the diagram, but they gain from this as well. I have a later slide that'll show you how these international producers gain, which will hopefully be of interest. But we can also say that the total surpluses, when we add everything up and think about the total societal gains, right, consumer plus producer surplus, gains from exchange there, that there is a gain from international trade here, right? What is that gain? Well, that's this triangle D, right? So this is kind of it's part of this recurring theme where when we enact a policy or we allow something to happen that wasn't before, there's a shift, right? One party, just like with rent control, there was a shift from producers to consumers, right, of surplus, but there was also in that case, a loss. Here we have it kind of working in reverse, right? We've shifted B from producers to consumers, but there's also been this gain of D from doing so. And there was a question, I'm sorry, yeah?
How come we don't have a loss in this case?
What kind of loss?
Deadweight loss.
Okay, why don't we have a deadweight loss? Well, we have
They lose something, they give up something, and we don't have a loss at all.
Right, I guess we do have a loss here. You could say that this B is a loss, right? That's a good point. So maybe this is a better way of saying what I was trying to say. Producers used to be getting B, but they've lost it due to trade, right? That's, I guess you could say, this is how we would describe the intensification of competition, right, in this diagram. We go from no trade to trade, producers lose B. So you might think about that as the loss. Well, the good news here is that consumers gain back the B, right? So that's sort of the offsetting gain. And as it happens, they not only gain that, but they also gain D, right? So we can kind of arrive at this conclusion that yes, some people are hurt by trade, right? But the gains to the winners, consumers, offset the losses to the losers who are producers here. Okay. So in later classes, like if you move on and take more public policy courses or some of our policy-oriented economics courses, you'll talk about how the big thing then that you have to think about is, We have these producers losing, that's not great. We have these gains from trade D here. Is there a way to redistribute those gains from trade so that everybody wins, right? And that's often a criterion you talk about in economics for efficiency. Is it possible to have gains that can be redistributed among everyone? I was thinking about this in the context of the longshoreman, right, thing, where there are certain things that happen, right, over time that make trade more efficient, so on and so forth, and this could result in loss of jobs for longshoremen. And so one thing that was interesting is they have these port royalties payments, which is kind of like this thing where you're saying, all right, well, we know we're going to lose some jobs here, but what we can do is we can pay royalties, right, from the port going forward to people who are displaced. And that's kind of like trying to redistribute this D. As I understand it, I mean, I saw this on the news, for 2 minutes, so I should be careful in talking too much about how that actually works. But that's kind of what's going on there. Okay, so there's a case for trade here, right? It's not Shangri-La where everybody gains. There are winners and losers, but the point is that the losses seem to be counterweighed by more than enough gains. What about an export market? Well, we could work through the whole case in detail, but maybe I'll just kind of cut to the chase here and show you what the punchline picture looks like. And it looks a little bit like this. But I'd like you to sort of look at this picture and first think about the counterfactual, which once again is the world without trade. What does that look like, right? And then when we allow trade, what does that look like? And we compare those two things, right, as carefully as we can. So, all right, we see here I have another market, and the idea here is to kind of, analogize things a little bit with the United States. Typically what the U.S. does is we import goods from other countries that involve, I guess, manufactured goods, things like that. And then we export kind of, I guess you could say, high-tech products. That's one big services, high-tech products, common U.S. exports. And so that's why I've used airplanes. We're a big airplane manufacturer. So you might think about it this way. Without trade, the U.S. produces 400 airplanes a year at a price of $100 million, right? Domestic air, maybe, I don't know, there's all kinds of different airplanes, so the typical airplane. 100 million, 400 of those a year. And you can see the surpluses once again, without trade. Without trade, consumers are getting A plus B, right? At this price of 100, and producers are getting C. So Boeing is earning C here, right? In this situation, or I should say the Boeings, the aircraft manufacturers of the United States. Okay, but then when we allow trade, so here the idea is that there's a lot of countries out there that can't produce airplanes as efficiently or as cheaply as we can. So there's a higher price that countries are willing to pay on the world market for a plane. So here we say that there's this going world price for an airplane of 150 million, right? Well, how does this impact the market in this case, this export market? Well, you can see that now we have something like a price floor without the surplus, right? Or where the surplus can be sent overseas and sold at the price floor. So the price rises from 100 to 150, and this is great for producers. Instead of getting just C relative to the no trade world, they're getting B plus C plus D, right? B plus C plus D. So that's a gain for producers. This isn't great for consumers because now they, in essence, have to compete, if you want to think about it this way, with overseas consumers, right? Nobody's going to sell a plane domestically at $100 or $100 million when they can sell it overseas for $150, so everybody now has to pay that price of $150. And the predictable effect is a lessening of consumer surplus from this higher price, right? We go from A plus B to B, or to just A, right? And I've written that here. So if you want to think about what the loss, and if you want to think about this in terms of losses, you would now say that B, by the way, the B is the whole trapezoid there. You would say B is the loss to consumers, right, from this market opening up for trade. Right? B is the loss. The good news is that B is gained back by producers, right? Producers get B back. And so now, not only that, but producers also earn D in producer surplus. So we wind up with a switch, or I should say a reallocation of surplus, the B, from producers to consumers. No, other way around, sorry. From consumers to producers, but there's also this gain that producers get, this D, which is our gains from trade, right? Our gains from world trade as exporters. So we see, once again, domestic producers win from having more market opportunities. Well, foreign consumers, we'll get to them in a second, right? I have a diagram. They're not really on the diagram yet, right? And our losers are domestic consumers, right? Once again, we can say there are winners and losers here, but the gains to the winners offset the losses to the losers, right? More than offset, I should say. And that's why we have the D triangle there. Okay. So I alluded to this, the international, the gains from international exporters or importers, they were also a party that we might want to think about how they benefit from trade. Well, here we can kind of, if you wanted to make the diagram a little bit more difficult, right, or not more difficult, but more complicated, instead of here where we haven't really said, we've just said there's a price, we haven't said anything about the rest of the world. Here we've kind of, I've drawn a diagram here where now we get a sense as to what this looks like when we put the importer and the exporter next to each other, right? And this kind of shows, or really hopefully gives you the idea that everybody benefits from trade here. So here now I switch to the sugar market. And you can kind of see here what happens on the left. We have a situation where the world price with trade is above the no trade price, right? So what happens is if we're talking about sugar produced in the United States or some other country, the price that can be gotten by domestic industry is higher than it otherwise would be. So some of the sugar is exported. That would be roughly this distance here. I'm just trying to go up, right? Exports. Well, what happens to these exports? Well, they go overseas, right? And they're brought to a place that really has a hard time producing sugar. What does that mean? Well, it means that the price is pretty high domestically, right? And when there's exposure to international trade, the price comes down. And here I've tried to draw this, or tried to get the diagram to be the case that these two distances are about the same, right? So that everything exported is imported somewhere else, right? Or in this other country. So this 2x2 example. And maybe you can kind of, if you look at the left-hand picture, right, you can see this picture, right? Focus on area D. If you look at the right-hand picture, maybe you can see this picture. And when you put it all together, you see that what happens is the D triangle that I've been labeled it, well, as I've labeled it, it's right there, right, shaded in blue. That's D for the exporter, and this is D for the importer. So if you can kind of imagine forming a diamond, or it doesn't have to be a diamond, it could be kind of a lopsided trapezoid. But this distance would be the same in both cases. You put that together and you can see that everybody's gaining from trade. So in this case, you would say the international consumer gains from trade. That's how you would see it here. And you can see here that the international, if you flip these around, that this would suggest that the international producer is gaining from trade as well. So it's kind of a neat little application of everything we've talked about to this particular setting. And indeed, this is a subject that economists feel pretty strongly about, right? That trade, international trade, is a good thing. Even as there are winners and losers, right, from international trade. And this is a debate that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And was one that Adam Smith more or less directly responded to when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, right? Because that was not the supposition prior to that, right? Prior to that, the idea was that you wanted to export as much as you could, the old mercantilist stuff. Export, export, export. You wanted to import as little as possible from anybody, right? Because that was bad. You were relying on someone else for something. There were foreign exchange arguments associated with that, which are fascinating. If you're interested, of course, we have trade classes on both international trade and international finance, where you dig deeply into the some of these aspects of trade. Okay, so here's kind of the big lesson once more, is that there are winners and losers, right, in each case, for those things we export and those things we import. It's interesting, though, that once again, as with the rent control and minimum wages, where we sort of saw that, our simple diagrams anyways suggest that there are social costs, deadweight losses to these things, we do often have intervention in international markets. And in fact, there are typically, across all kinds of markets, a lot of restrictions on imports, right? And you might sort of wonder, well, why is it the case we get all, if Baker's diagrams, which look so plain and easy to understand, show that there's benefits, why do we so often see import restrictions, right? We'll get into some of the other reasons, which go beyond the graph in a second. But we might also think about, this thing we talked about before, is that sometimes the interests are very concentrated, right? The interests for intervention in a market are very concentrated. So the longshoreman example is really a good one because they clearly depend for a living on goods coming through the ports and being paid a certain wage, right? What does that mean to the rest of us? Well, when the longshoremen get a higher wage or, get some other restriction on the way, the container industry operates, well, that increases costs for us, right? But for each of us, not very much. So what happens to the price of, say, a T-shirt? Well, maybe it goes from $5 to $5.02, right? That's not a giant impact on any one of us. Whereas, a longshoreman losing his job, or a couple hundred or thousands losing their jobs, that's a pretty concentrated interest. Okay, so that might be one reason why we typically see a lot of this. But one thing we might want to do, or one thing we can do, is we can think a little bit using our diagram about the protections. I spelled that correctly. Why is it giving me a spell correct? I have to check, I'm sorry. Oh, we'll switch it to protectionism, okay. I don't like seeing that red squiggly line. So we can look at our diagram and understand a little bit about the mechanics of how tariffs work and what they do. It's a little bit like what we did with tax incidents, right? Where we want to sort of parse things into, how much money do we make from tariffs? Once again, we have to raise, as a government, we need to raise money for projects somehow. One way of doing that might be tariffs, right? So we first want to start off with saying, okay, well, let's suppose we have trade. What happens when we slap a tariff on this product? Well, if you look at what I've done here, is I've said, all right, well, think about this world price, I guess T-shirts, if you need a number, $5, right? And then think about the size of the tariff. Maybe it's $1. Well, the thing that happens in this international market is the price, the world price, right, for us, then becomes the world price plus the tariff, right? Why is this the case? So what I'm saying in my T-shirt example is that this world price, or the world price is $5. If we put a $1 tariff on T-shirts, our domestic price becomes $6, right? So it goes up by the full amount of the tariff. Well, why is that the case? Think about an international supplier of T-shirts. They're looking around the world and they're saying, okay, well, I can sell a T-shirt there for $5. I can sell one over here for $5. If I go to the United States, I have to pay $1 just to get my T-shirts in the door, right? If the price goes up to $5.50 or $5.75, it's not in my interest to do so. Why would I pay the $1 to get my T-shirts into the United States and then sell them at a price for $5.75? I'm losing, after the tariff, I'm then getting $4.75 per T-shirt. I'm losing money. The only way I'll sell my shirts in the United States is if the price rises to cover the tariff. So I sell a T-shirt in the U.S. for $6 and pay $1 on a tariff. that's exactly like getting $5 in the US as I do everywhere else in the world, right? So the rational international traders require this to supply any t-shirts to the US. So this means that the price in the United States will rise by the amount of the tariff. And, from the perspective of producers and consumers, the analysis is exactly the same as before, right? It's exactly the same as before. It's like the world price is P world plus tariff. So we get the consumer surplus up there as green, the producer surplus down here is yellow, right? And we're kind of done with it. But we can now use our free trade price without the tariff as a benchmark to think about how the world changes as we move from the world without the tariff or trade without tariffs to the tariff. And you can see that this whole triangle would have been part of societal welfare, right? Would have been part of societal welfare, but now it disappears because of the tariff. Well, we still have imports, right? We still import some t-shirts, and in fact, we import this amount of t-shirts at this tariff price, right? And so if we want to, you hopefully know how to do this also with some of the diagrams we've worked with. We know the tariff is this big, and we have this many imports at this price, right? Because suppliers stop here, produce, and consumers demand there. So we get this amount here. We multiply the size of the tariff times the imports, and we get the tariff revenues, right? So if you wanted to do the welfare calculation, maybe you would say, well, after the tax, after the tariff, we now have A plus, or yellow plus green plus blue as part of our welfare, right? Of course, compared to what we had without the tariff, we're now losing these two red shaded areas, right? Those are gains from world trade that are now lost because of the tariff, right? So there is a deadweight loss, but we offset this with tax revenue, or tariff revenue in this case. And the rest of the story is more or less the same. So you might even say that the tariff benefits, I guess, the policymaker, the government, and also producers. Might be part of the story here, at the expense of consumers, in that the gains to producers in tax revenue and to producers don't offset the loss to consumers. And so here's the deadweight loss from the tariff. Yes?
Just to clarify, Q3 is the amount of product being sold and bought after.
Yeah, that's the total amount. That's one way to think about it is, I should be clear. After the tariff, because our effective price is P tariff here on this diagram, Q3 is demanded by consumers, Q2 is supplied by domestic suppliers, and then the rest becomes imports, right? Of course, at the world price before, we had Q1 supplied, Q4 demanded, and then Q1 to Q4 would be the total imports.
Tax we apply only on the import price.
Yeah, the tariff only is paid by importers, right? But it raises that. I guess that's I should emphasize that that the price goes up for everybody, right?
Yeah.
Because this is kind of what's constraining in these diagrams the domestic suppliers, right? They have to conform with the price that international suppliers are getting or are willing to take. Okay. So a quota is a little bit more difficult, and so I'm going to kind of go through this. I'm using up more time than I might have hoped. I'm going to go through it, and it might be one of these things that you have to ruminate on a little bit. I don't think I'm going to test you on this. There is a homework, by the way, that has some tariff stuff in it. I'm not going to post it right away because I'm hoping I can get the top hat stuff figured out, right? The section switching in the next couple of days, and then by Thursday I'll get you a homework where you can practice some of this stuff. But it's interesting to just, for one particular reason, I would like to visit this quota case and explain this diagram a little bit to you. What is a quota? Well, a quota is actually a very common policy instrument for managing international trade or restricting international trade. And it basically says that we are only going to import a fixed amount of units from overseas. in a given market. So very common import quotas, which actually have their twists and turns that are quite interesting. One of which is the automobile industry, right, where there's specific quotas on how many cars can be imported from overseas every year. So how does this change the picture here? Well, think about it this way. There's a world price out there for maybe it's automobiles. I know those are varied goods, but for the typical car, we'll say, there's a world price. And we want to import a certain amount of those, right? Normally at this world price, we would want to import, well, according to my diagram, from here to here, right? Our suppliers would stop here and we would import the rest. Well, what if we just cut off the imports, right? At this point. Well, we can then bring in as many cars as we like at this price, right? Well, we can bring in this amount of cars at this price, but then our domestic suppliers have to kind of kick back into production, and what happens is our price rises above the domestic price, right? So you might think about it in one of two ways. You might sort of say, well, we go up to the price, bring in as much as we can under the quota, and then our supply resumes. You might also think about it as we're looking for a point where, as we move up our supply curve, we have our import. We can wedge our import quota, right, in between demand and supply. But this diagram, the way it's drawn, allows us to compare the no quota case with the quota case. So what is the punchline here? Well, without the quota, we have the usual societal welfare. Producer surplus is down here. Consumer surplus is all of that area, right? A, B, C, D, E prime, and F. Once we put the quota in place, well, what happens is the price with the quota rises up to here, much like the tariff, right? And now we have domestic producers getting G plus C, domestic consumers getting A plus B, right? So what happens? What happens to this? What is this box here? This E prime plus E prime prime. Well, if you think about what's happening, is those foreign automakers that are allowed to export products to us, that is to say, those foreign makers of automobiles, say, that get to export to the United States, from which we import, right? Well, they get now a premium, right? They get a difference of this. The price they get in the United States is this, whereas the world price is this, and that's because there's only so many imports, right? So you can kind of see on this diagram how we benefit, or how they benefit from this. So long story short, what happens in this case is E prime plus E prime prime is not tax revenue, right? That is revenue that accrues to those exporters who send their cars to the United States, right? Those who are lucky enough to be the ones picked to fulfill our import quota, right? So you might think about this in a lot of the ways that we have before. Maybe this box measures how much those exporters are willing to spend to get access to U.S. markets. At the end of the day, it's very much like a tax, right? Where you just have to think about where exactly that green shaded box goes. Does it go to the foreign companies, or does it go to the government because they're able to kind of sell the favors to the firms that they want, right? So it's very much like a tax. Okay, so we do lose D plus F there, right? All right, so that's, and I went through that kind of quickly. Once again, you might have to think about that a little bit, and maybe that's a useful exercise just to get used to the nuances of all of these diagrams. There are, I guess, broader arguments about trade, and they're fairly enduring, right? These are ongoing debates that we have at least every 4 years. Whenever there's a presidential election, there's always a discussion about trade, about how we're importing too much of some things, maybe not enough of others, all of these things. And so I thought maybe it would be useful to just spend a couple of minutes talking about these arguments, maybe not using all the tools that we talked about, but just thinking about these things the way an economist might, right? So the usual arguments are fourfold, right, against trade. So there's these national security arguments, right, people make. They say, well, we shouldn't be importing critical resources, right? Oil, agriculture, other critical resources, we shouldn't be importing those. Steel, that's a big one, right? That one crops up in presidential debate settings all the time. Steel, aluminum, stuff like that. So maybe those things we want to restrict trade. There's also these so-called infant industry arguments, right? We want to protect our critical industries, right? That are, the new industries that are critical to competing on the world. We want to protect those from competition so they can grow, right? Semiconductors, that was a big one back in in the 80s and 90s. We need protection for that industry. Well, maybe we want to restrict trade because of that. There are dumping arguments, right? People sometimes say, well, there's countries out there that are flooding our markets with cheap foreign goods, right? And that's bad. We might want to stop them from doing that. They're putting domestic producers out of business by flooding the market with these cheap foreign products. And of course, we have the standard jobs protection argument, is that in that free trade, we lose jobs because of this. Okay, so I'm going to sort of just talk these through one by one. And really, I'm going to kind of say this like, well, this is why you shouldn't believe these arguments. But really what I want you to do is not necessarily think about it that way. I want you to sort of think about it as, frame it in terms of a counterfactual. Okay, when we put these restrictions in place, this happens. If we didn't have them, that would happen. And be honest with yourself about that, right? Even if you feel like any one of these reasons is good, right, you should at least acknowledge that there are the costs that we've described, the lost societal benefits that we've described previously. So national security. Right? This was actually a big part of Adam Smith. He talked a lot about this in The Wealth of Nations, that this was a good reason to restrict trade. I have a little link to an article here. I'll click on it just to show you what the flavor is. And so it is this, does national security justify tariffs? And it's also a nice overview of a lot of the stuff I said about trade. Well, maybe it does. But it's often hard to identify the critical industries, right? And those industries that we think are critical, like, so oil or even steel or aluminum, they're often not concentrated the way we think. So it's more difficult than you might think to target these particular industries. And it's also the case that a lot of these industries are much more elastic, right, than you might think in production, particularly for the United States. Like we have this, it happens pretty regularly when the price of oil is high, a whole bunch of production comes online in the United States, right, pretty rapidly. You think about something like oil, it seems like it would be hard to ramp up production. But it turns out in a matter of months, it can be pretty much there to fulfill demand. And then when the price goes down, it sort of goes away again, right? Which is in some ways a proxy for, I guess, trade restriction. It's also, one of the aspects here, this kind of bleeds over into the infant industry argument, and I'll talk about a different aspect there, is that it's really hard to pick winners and identify critical industries ahead of time. Right? This is a really difficult thing. If you were good at it, you could make millions, if not billions, in the stock market. Right? We all could. But the old Yogi Berra quote is a good one. Right? Prediction is hard, especially about the future. And one thing I often do is being an economist, it ruins a lot of things for you. Science fiction is one of them. So, like if you see an older science fiction movie, it's often interesting because presumably a science fiction movie embodies what someone thinks like the future is going to look like, right? And so I go back to Star Wars, which came out when I was a kid. The first one, which is I guess now Episode 4, right? Star Wars 1. There were no PCs in that movie at all. Right? Nobody had any phones or any computers. Nobody was punching things into computers with little screens and all of that stuff because they didn't really exist at the time, and nobody thought they would in the future. Right? Now they're sort of this, giant piece of our lives. Another weird one, by the way, was Blade Runner, which was made in the 80s with Harrison Ford, Sean Young. Daryl Hannah, some of you might know who those people are. But that one has like these weird floating advertising blimps all over the, once again, no PCs as we would think them. And you're like, well, this is interesting. This is what someone thought the future was going to look like. So it's really hard to predict. And together these arguments suggest that, well, trying to sort of do things for the purposes of manage the economy for these reasons is difficult. What about dumping? So dumping, this is this, you're selling a product at a very low price to try to capture an overseas market. But this is a difficult game to play, right? So you're going to flood the market with, say, cheap oil, right? We're going to sell oil to the United States for $10 a barrel, right? And then all of a sudden, well, so what's the problem with that? Well, I guess the problem would be all of a sudden if you jack up the price and say, ha-ha, right? That might be a temporary problem, but as I've previously argued, oftentimes domestic industry responds really rapidly, and in fact, market forces are such that the more rapid you respond, the more money you'll make, right? Suppliers, so people have very vested interest in jumping into any market where this is going on, right? So that's the chain of logic there. I can eliminate competition and then jack up the price. It's very difficult to do that in practice and make any money. You're likely to lose a lot more money than you'll gain in the end. I'll have some counters to these arguments when we talk a little bit more about strategic behavior later in class, but that might be the argument against this logic here. Infant industries. Right? That is to say, we want to nurture the critical industries so they can develop. Well, the first thing I said was that, well, figuring out what those critical industries are is much more difficult than you might think, right? But strictly on an efficiency level basis, it's often the case that if you start off by subsidizing an industry, it never becomes efficient on its own, right? That is to say, there's that time where you're going to remove the support for the industry or its protection never comes, and when it does, the industry is more or less incapable of standing on its own. So I think about this like if you ever watch those nature shows where you think about breeding animals in captivity, right? There's surprisingly successfully, zoos and places like that, they can sort of take, I guess eggs, I'm thinking of like condors or something. You can take these condors, hatch them from eggs, and then through this painstaking process you can train them to be able to live on their own in the wild. But it's extraordinarily costly and difficult to do so, right? I'm thinking about like a tiger or a bear or something. If you try to raise one of those in captivity and then release it in the wild, it's not going to work so well, right? It's difficult. And that's kind of an analogy I think about here, is that insulation from competition, once you have it, it's very hard to get used to competing. And of course, the other thing that you could say about this is the whole time we're hurting our own consumers, right? They're often the ones that are sort of left out of the picture, that consumer surplus triangle, right? Okay, well, job protection, you can sort of go down the list and you can say the things that I've already said. One thing that's often lost in these debates is that every time you protect an industry to save jobs, in some sense you're destroying others, right? You're getting rid of, I guess, in the interest of time here, I'll move along a little bit. When you protect the workers in one industry, you're hurting workers in a whole bunch of other industries. So, for example, if we protect the automobile workers, well, there's a lot of industries out there that rely on automobiles, right? The rental car industry, for example, or the delivery industry. All of them now face higher costs than they did before. Good one, cabs. Right? That raises the cost not only for them, but also for us consumers, right? Everything becomes more expensive across the economy, and that's often lost here, right? So that's an important thing to think about, that some jobs are created and some are, some are protected, but some are lost. One thing I was going to say is this also applies to products, like if you protect, say, the steel industry, well, all of the businesses that use steel, right, have to pay a higher price for it. And that's something that's worth thinking about. Once again, I don't mean to suggest that you'd never want to protect trade, but you have to think about all of these issues here, and that's very true for the last couple things I'm going to say here, which are perhaps the most controversial, right? And so, fair trade, right? This is a big subject these days. A question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, when New York resumes decongestion pricing, how do you think that'll affect us?
Oh boy, congestion pricing. So that's a big subject. I can say that if I had to sort of do the analysis off the top of my head, I might think about our tax incidence example. I might also say that we're going to revisit that very subject when we talk about, when we talk about environment and externalities. I'm going to mention that at the end of class today, environmental policy. And I'm also going to introduce that when I think about what might be some clever market-based alternatives to policies like that. Anyways, fair trade, right? So the idea here is that you say, well, we're not going to trade with countries that have unfair business practices. Okay, but let me ask you, what is the counterfactual, right? In this case, well, we know what it is for our country. We're saying, well, we're willing to pay a bit more for products, right, to sort of get fairer, I guess, better treatment overseas. But if you think about the people overseas, well, are we really helping them? That's a good question. You kind of have to assume that they aren't rational, right? If you're going to say that we're helping them. Well, why is this? Because when you sort of engage in fair trade, when you produce something at a low price overseas, pay people less to do it. That was weird. Oh my God.
What happened?
Never mind. I'll tell you after class. When you think about it this way, you're saying, okay, well, there's these jobs that don't pay all that well, but they pay better than my alternatives, so maybe what I'll do is I'll go work at this company. You're getting rid of those jobs. And in some sense, you're saying you're taking a rational choice away from people in foreign countries who choose, to work at low-wage jobs, yes, but maybe that's because their alternative is not so great. Right? The other thing you might think about here is that if you do business with foreign countries, if you do business with foreign countries and say that they're going to have to pay this, you're only going to work with the places that pay the fair wage, well, that induces a rationing problem. Suddenly you're making some very good jobs in a country that go alongside all of the low-paying ones that were there before. Now the question becomes, how do you ration those jobs? It's a lot like the price floor, right? The minimum wage floor. You're creating a rationing problem in that country, and you have to ask two questions. Who gets the jobs? Who gets the surplus accruing to those jobs, right? In a lot of less developed countries, this is a very difficult problem in that a lot of times the surplus is captured, right, by people that you don't think or you don't want to. The same is true of a price floor, right? And these are things that you have to consider here. Like the price floor. Okay, there's a little excitement here, so maybe I'll wrap this up and then I'll tell you and then we can go. Remember your counterfactuals. Okay, so going forward, we're going to talk a little bit more about supply and demand, right, in a competitive market, but we're going to flesh out the details. And then we're going to talk about the exceptions. Baker's free market fairy tale here might be coming to an end when I get to these things. It was a mouse. It fell from the ceiling and was running around over there. Yes. So the good news is the mouse is okay. Right? I'll see you next time. Get your corrections to me.